Welcome to the third episode of JEC Interviews, where we connect with leaders in business, economics, and finance to gain valuable insights from their experience. My name is Rachel, the co-director of marketing at the Junior Economist Club of Mississauga, and today I'm joined with my colleague Zaina, a council member. And today we are honored to welcome Ms. Shelly Kaushik. So Shelly joined BMO Economics in 2020 and conducts research on the Canadian and regional economics. She also provides support on fiscal policy and country risk analysis. Prior to joining BMO Economics, Shelly worked on fiscal policy at the Department of Finance Canada. She holds a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Waterloo and a master's degree in economics from Queen's University. Ms. Kaushik, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, guys.
Okay, that's great to hear. We are thrilled to have you with us. Let's dive right into our first question. So, what inspired you to pursue a career in economics, and what continues to motivate you in your work with BMO Economics?
Yeah, I decided to take economics in high school kind of on a whim. I was in high school during the 2008 financial crisis, and at that point, I didn't know anything about the economy, and suddenly it was everywhere, kind of like right now. And so I was like, what is the economy? I have no idea. I've never heard this word before. I don't know what it means or why it matters and
Mhm.
why it's so bad right now. And so that's kind of why I started taking those classes. And then as I just continued in high school and then in university, I found it was very easy for me to connect exactly what I was seeing in the news with kind of, my day-to-day life or, my parents or other people's lives. So that's really what still motivates me right now is, just being able to see kind of the big picture and, how exactly it's relatable, not just to people, but, one thing, like for example, in the housing market, how it relates to trade policy or vice versa, things like that. So I really like looking at, the big picture.
Yeah. Okay, so that's really cool. That's really fascinating. So, building on that, could you tell us more about what it's like to work for BMO and your journey to this career?
Yeah, so it's very fast paced, especially right now when things are changing very, very quickly in the economics world. But really, my job is kind of data driven. So it's a mix of both technical, as in actually looking at the data, doing forecasts, analyzing data as it comes out, and some element of, those soft skills like
Yeah.
communication, presenting, answering questions, talking to people, really trying to distill economic concepts down for people who may not necessarily have that background. So yeah, I like that it's a bit of a mix of both. And yeah, I think that's kind of similar skills that I've been able to use and kind of sharpen throughout my career. I've worked at the federal government, like you mentioned, as well. And that job had very similar roles or requirements and responsibilities. I really like that, mix of both technical and non-technical skills and aspects.
Yeah, so that was really insightful. Thank you for sharing. So let's shift gears into our next question. So, in your research on the Canadian and regional economics, how do you see economic principles playing a role in shaping people's everyday decisions, both individually and collectively?
Yeah, sorry, I think it's a bit easier to see these days when we're in kind of these
Hmm.
once in a lifetime types of events with tariffs and things like that. But even during the pandemic, so you mentioned regional economies. We saw a lot of people, and still to some degree are seeing people moving out of more expensive areas like in Toronto, suburbs of Toronto, things like that, because it's just so expensive to live in these places and going to more affordable areas like places like Alberta, where it's not just cheaper, but there may be better job opportunities or a better economic outlook, or even places like Atlantic Canada, where again, it's still relatively more affordable. So I think, I personally know some people who have made those moves, and I've met a lot of people who have made those moves, like literally from Ontario. So yeah, I think that's a pretty cool way of being able to tell exactly how that big picture actually impacts people. And I would also point out with tariffs, we all buy things that come from outside of the country. We buy things from China, from the US all the time. A lot of us work for places that are located somewhere else. We live right near the border, most people in this country. So I think that is another thing that's like very easy to be able to tell exactly how that impacts all of us.
Yeah, so that's really cool. I also realized that I also have a lot of friends who also moved from Ontario all the way to Alberta
Yeah,
because
exactly.
yeah, so that actually makes a lot of sense. So that leads me perfectly into my next question. So, given your extensive background in fiscal policy, what is one key economic concept related to public finance that you believe everyone should understand regardless of their career path?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to understand just the fact that fiscal policy matters to people. I think people tend to kind of glaze over it if you're not in the field. It's like budgets and things like that is a little bit, can be a little bit dry. But the fact is, I mean, of course, it depends on the budget and it depends on the level of government and stuff like that. But this stuff matters. And especially from a fiscal perspective, I think it matters like when you're talking about, for example, the provincial government in Canada. The provincial government is responsible for healthcare and education, and that's like two of the most important aspects of your day-to-day life. So again, even if you don't care about, what's going on day to day in the government, this stuff still matters to you. So exactly how much money is being spent, where it's being spent, that kind of thing is I still think that's very important for people to know and keep track of.
Yeah, thank you. So that was very enlightening. Sorry.
Sure.
So, on a related note, with your background in fiscal policy from the Department of Finance and now at BMO, I want to ask about what are some of the biggest misunderstandings you've noticed among youth or even professionals when it comes to how government spending and taxation decisions actually affect the economy?
Yeah, I think people tend to either over or underestimate exactly how those things impact the economies. Some people will think, a government policy will change things very, very drastically. Like, for example, we have for the last, I would say, almost 10 years at this point, we have a number of governments at different levels of government. It's not just federal. Promising to like double the pace of housing construction or bring all of these new houses online to help housing affordability. That hasn't actually happened. In fact, the amount of construction is down over the last year or so. And I think that's a good example of showing, okay, it's not just governments that matter to the day-to-day markets, right? So if you're, for example, a construction worker or someone deciding whether or not to develop new housing, you're not necessarily going to be looking just at these promises by the government. You're going to be looking at the cost of labor, the cost of building materials, supply chains, things like that. So there's a lot more out there than just the government. But then on the flip side, again, there's also this aspect of people thinking that whatever the government does doesn't necessarily matter to me. And again, I think it's easier to just kind of ignore that when things are good, but we're seeing kind of the flip side of that. It's kind of impossible to ignore what governments are doing when things are more uncertain or, when people are feeling a bit more stressed. That's when it becomes more obvious, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't matter when things are good either.
Okay, so that was really fascinating. Now, shifting gears a little, I was wondering, based on your current work analyzing Canadian economic trends, what should young Canadians know about the impact of inflation and rising interest rates on things like student loans, rent, and early career opportunities?
Yeah, so I mean, inflation is very fascinating. It's very wide reaching. It's something we didn't really have to pay a lot of attention to until the pandemic, because we did actually have pretty low and stable inflation. So the pandemic kind of showed us that, we can't take that for granted. And I think younger Canadians, because you may not have had that experience beforehand, I think you already kind of know you can't take it for granted. And especially as this world is changing again, especially as we have these tariffs and other risks to the inflation outlook. So yeah, I think it's important to kind of look exactly what is causing things like inflation. So if you see a headline that inflation went up or inflation went down, that's just a mathematical calculation for the average basket. CPI weighted basket, right? That may or may not actually affect you. So for example, over the last couple of years, one of the biggest things that was causing, one of the biggest components causing inflation to remain high was mortgage interest costs, right? And that may or may not actually affect you if you are, a student that doesn't have a mortgage. What would affect you would be something like rent, right? Which was also one of the higher components. And so that kind of discernment is important. I know StatCan, for example, has on their website, a way to calculate your own CPI basket. So you can put in what you buy, how much you buy, and they will give you a calculation in and of itself. So that's a good way to kind of compare your own data with the stuff that you see in the news. And then things with like interest rates. I mean, there's a pretty clear, if you go shopping on a credit card, you're going to see, credit card statement, you get charged interest if you don't pay that off, right? And so that kind of stuff, I think, is like a very direct impact on everyday people. So when, for example, the Bank of Canada changes the interest rate, that's not necessarily going to hit you immediately on your credit card bill or something like that, but it will eventually flow through. So, when you're making your own personal finance decisions on whether it's shopping on your credit card, whether it's a student loan, that's when you're going to see those kinds of things, especially, again, if you have debt, or on the other side, if you're trying to look to save or build, an emergency fund, something like that. Changes in interest rates will also affect how much return you get on that as well. So there's a lot of ways that these things kind of affect people on a daily basis. It's important, and I think as economics students, y'all probably have a bit of a leg up on that. But it's important to know when you're making your own financial decisions how these big picture things can have an impact.
Okay, so thank you so much for that insightful advice so far. I will now pass it over to my colleague Zania to continue with the next half of the interview.
Sure.
Thanks, Rachel. I've loved listening to your advice so far. So moving on to the next topic, what challenges did you face bringing into the field of economics, especially as a woman?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a bit harder. I didn't know anyone in the field, right? So I think getting my foot in the door at the beginning was, it's always difficult no matter who you are, but especially, if you don't have that experience or that built-in network to help out. So what I really did, I mean, through undergrad, I had my own co-op program in economics. And so I didn't just do economics co-ops. During that time, I did anything I could get, right? And I was lucky enough to get a few that were related to economics that were in my field. But, I did some stuff related to marketing. I just kind of did whatever to kind of try things out and see exactly what I liked. Because if you've ever done any sort of co-op or internship or anything like that, you'll know that what you learn in school is very different from how the real world works. And so the number one best advice I can give to anyone is to get that experience when you're in school. And then also just, practicing interview skills, practicing, communication in general skills, because when you are interviewing or networking or anything like that, it really does matter how you come across to people. And so, that's how you kind of set yourself apart from anyone else, because, everyone's looking for a job. Everyone has, good grades, great extracurriculars, things like that. It's really the difference is, how you can make yourself stand out.
That was very enlightening. On a related note, I actually wanted to ask you about where do you see the most significant opportunities for young people in economics over the next 10 years?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think it depends where you are. Like for example, in Toronto, we have a lot of, finance related industries. In Ottawa, for example, there's obviously the government, which is in Toronto as well on the provincial level. I think it's going to be very interesting over the next 10 years to see exactly how some of those big sectors that we usually think about, like trade, like housing, things like that, kind of come out of all of this changing world. So at the end of the day, I think it's about being flexible more than, forecasting exactly what the job market's going to look like in 10 years. It's more about, building those skills and recognizing exactly which skills will allow you to still stay marketable to employers in times of transition, in times when things are a bit tougher, right? And so, things like keeping up with technology, keeping up with, as much as it's a buzzword, I'm sure you've heard this from your professors and from everyone else, keeping up with changes in AI, or even just how to use it properly instead of just dumping everything into AI. And again, those communication aspects, I don't think I can stress that enough. It is especially, when you're talking about workplaces with different generations or different technological abilities. I think that communication piece is really, really important, not just to market yourself, but to make sure that people understand exactly what you bring to the table.
That's actually a really great point. Thank you so much. So you've worked with both in government and the private sector, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what are the key difference in how each approach economics?
Yeah, I think it really depends where you are. Both the government and the private sector are very big umbrellas. And so, two jobs are not going to be the same. Two jobs in government, two jobs in private sector are not going to be the same. I was lucky enough to have, a very private sector-like job in the government. So I worked in the Department of Finance. I worked on the budget. So it was still very timeline focused, still very data driven focused, and a lot of, briefings to, upper levels of management, ministers, deputy ministers. And so I got to, again, kind of practice those skills, but that's not always the case. Again, government is very big. And so there are a lot of people, that kind of the stereotype of government that have those jobs with slower timelines, possibly, a bit less work to do or, a bit less focus. But again, that's not the case everywhere, right? So like, again, that wasn't my experience. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that you're, doomed if you go to the government. So that's one thing. Same thing with the private sector, right? It's a very large bucket. Yeah, so it's less about which sector specifically you're in and more about, what interests you, what kind of team, for example, that you're interviewing for, things like that.
Okay, so actually building on that, what skills or mindsets do you believe that are most important for the next generation of economists?
Yeah, definitely staying open. Again, this is kind of a period of transition right now for the economy. And so we're going to have a lot of shifts in what exactly it looks like. Again, in terms of, we have a lot of trade right now with the US. Are we going to keep being structured that way or not, right? Are we going to diversify? If so, how much? Things like that. So again, being open to all kinds of opportunities, making sure that like it's definitely good to have goals. I'm not saying don't do that, but making sure that your goals aren't so narrowly focused that you may or may not see any opportunities that don't necessarily fit into that box, because you might be surprised. And even if you open yourself up to an opportunity or an experience that isn't necessarily what you wanted, that's still a learning opportunity, right? That's still something you can use in an interview or on your resume to show that you can work in a different environment, you can face challenges, things like that. So yeah, definitely don't limit yourself, especially when times are a bit more tough out there to find a job. Any job is better than no job. So yeah, I would just leave it at that.
That was actually really insightful. So, since we talked about mindset, can you actually walk us through a typical day looks like for you at BMO Economics?
Yeah, so typical day is a lot less typical nowadays because so much of it is driven by the news, by the data. It can change very quickly, as anyone who's paying attention to the news knows right now. So we do focus on the news, we do focus on what markets are doing, but at the end of the day, it is also about the data. And so if there is, a major data release coming out, usually it's in the morning, especially in Canada. That is, kind of the top priority of the morning. So we do our analysis, we do, our forecast, things like that. We're also looking ahead to the next week. So we usually run on kind of a weekly schedule. So we're not just focusing on what's coming out right now, we're focusing on what's coming out next week, how to analyze what's coming out next week. We do a lot of presentations as well, answer a lot of client requests or media requests, especially right now. And so we're kind of prepping that or doing that and or doing that. So it's a bit of, again, reacting, but also trying to be proactive to what's going to happen, and trying your best to maintain your sanity amongst all that. So yeah, day to day is very hard because nothing is typical right now, but again, staying glued to everything, trying to keep as informed as possible and trying to share information as best you can with your teammates as well.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. I never really thought of it that way. So, looking back, is there anything that you would have done differently in your career?
Great question. Yeah, I mean, probably focusing on networking, things like that. So one of the areas, like I did mention, of course, I took co-op jobs in different areas, different sectors. But I think, just like making sure I keep that network open in terms of, people who may or may not be necessarily just in economics. I had a lot of friends that were in a lot of other fields from high school, things like that. But just, broadening that scope a little bit more, I think would have been good. And, just keeping up with those tech skills as well, because tech, coding, all of that changes so quickly. If you don't keep up with it, then you're going to lose it because it's just moving so fast. So I think those would be kind of the two main things.
Yeah, this really makes sense. So as someone with both academic and professional experience in economics, what resources would you suggest to help young Canadians get a strong grasp of fiscal policy and regional economic dynamics, whether they're future economists or just want to make informed decisions?
First off, I would say definitely the news, and not just one news source. Especially these days, you can get very different analysis and conclusions depending on who you're reading. So keep an open mind and broad in terms of like who and what you're reading in terms of the news. But also, just if you're interested in fiscal policy, just look up what the government's doing. It can sound a little bit intimidating because the government has this, reputation of being very boring and dry. But they all actually do have a lot of websites, especially these days, and a lot of pages that are, in a bit more plain language. And if you're confused, you can always just Google, right, what something means or how it affects people, things like that. Especially, again, try to relate it to yourself so that you can understand why it's important and you can understand why people should care or why it affects other areas of the economy. So, for example, if it's like tax time and you need to do your taxes, you can look up, okay, like what exactly is, this tax credit, or, what's the education tax credit? Why is it like that? What are the limits? What are any recent changes? Is anyone proposing any recent changes? And then that will, I think, help you become a better informed person, not just economist. Yeah, and then just read what other economists are saying too. Like it's similar to the news in that, different economists will say different things about the same data. But I think that that's a good skill to be able to tell, what are different ways to analyze one specific thing, what are the advantages, disadvantages of something that's happening, things like that. What are different consequences? So it kind of helps you keep that open mind and keep learning. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That's actually really informative. So, as we wrap up, I'd like to ask one final thing. If you could give one piece of career advice to students interested in studying economics and pursuing a career like yours, what would it be?
Say have fun, just follow your interests. Again, economics can look very dry or sound very dry, but it's quite at least I think it's very interesting. Obviously, I'm an economist, but yeah, it's a very broad field of study, right? There's psychology, there's sociology, there's finance, math, just everything under the sun can have some sort of relationship with economics, even things like physics or hard sciences, right? So Yeah, just find your interest, even if it's outside of economics, because I can guarantee you there's some sort of link there with economics. And so even if you don't end up being an economist, just having that knowledge of those linkages is really important. And I think that's a really good skill, again, to just be an informed person just in your day-to-day life.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting advice, especially in how we like manage our day-to-day life. So thank you so much actually for taking the time to share your insight and experience with us today. It's really been a pleasure having this conversation with you.
Sure, thank you both.
Okay, and with that, we conclude our third episode of JEC Interviews. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Be sure to follow us for more conversations with industry leaders. Until next time.